The night hums quietly. A candle flickers beside your bed. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine a time when fun meant something very different. A time when laughter echoed in cobbled squares, when joy came not from screens or songs, but from the oddest, strangest, and most delightful things the human heart could invent. It is the Middle Ages, somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries. The air smells of earth and wood smoke. Villages sleep beneath the moonlight, and the only music is the creak of carts and the distant bark of a dog. But even here, amid the cold stone and quiet prayers, people long for joy. And how they found it is a story far stranger than you might think. In the tiny English village of Hatherby, there lived a young boy named Thomas, the son of a blacksmith. Thomas was a curious soul, the sort who looked at puddles and saw little worlds, who stared at clouds until he could see castles in them. His father often said, "Boy, your mind is always walking somewhere else." And it was true. Thomas dreamed not of forging iron but of laughter, of stories, of wonder. But in the medieval world, life was heavy. The fields called early, the nights came cold, and joy was a thing one had to make, not find. It was the spring fair, the only week of the year when the village awoke with color. Traveling jesters came with painted faces, merchants shouted their prices, and for once, music filled the muddy streets. Thomas watched, eyes wide, as a man in a floppy red hat stood before a crowd with a bucket full of frogs. "Ladies and good men," the jester cried, "the great frog leaping contest begins." Laughter erupted as villagers knelt to cheer for their chosen frog. Some even named them Sir Leapy, Greenfoot, Mud Knight. Thomas laughed so hard his stomach hurt. It was ridiculous and wonderful. In a world of endless chores and silent Sundays, people found happiness in a frog race. That night, as the torches dimmed, Thomas's mother said, "Strange things bring joy, don't they?" He nodded. "It's silly," he said, "but it made everyone forget their worries." And that, perhaps, is the secret thread that ties our time to theirs. Even in darkness, humans invent laughter. In the next village over, a group of young men prepared for what they called the game of hot hands. It was simple: 2 players placed their palms over a burning candle. Whoever pulled away first lost. The crowd would chant and clap, pride was worth the pain. They called it bravery, though to us it would look like madness. But to them, it was proof of strength, courage, and endurance, values that ruled their lives. Thomas once sneaked away to watch. The candlelight danced over faces full of awe and daring. He saw boys becoming men in that small circle of firelight. And when one of them, Edric, held his hand till the skin smoked, the crowd lifted him up like a hero. Thomas didn't understand why, but he felt the thrill. To suffer, to laugh, to win respect, all mixed together in one heartbeat of applause. That night, Thomas whispered to himself, "Maybe people aren't strange, maybe they're just trying to feel alive." Years passed. Thomas grew taller, his hair darker, his thoughts deeper. He became an apprentice in the castle forge, crafting swords and hinges. But every season, when the fair returned, he would walk among the performers and games, remembering how laughter once felt. He saw bear baiting, a cruel form of entertainment where chained animals were teased by dogs. He saw dancing fools dressed as bishops, mocking the church in secret festivals called the Feast of Fools. He saw mock trials, where donkeys were sentenced for eating crops, and the villagers held with joy. To our modern minds, it all seems bizarre. But in the medieval heart, laughter was rebellion, a small defiance against hardship, hunger, and death. When you lived with so little certainty, any reason to laugh became sacred. Thomas met a girl that year. Her name was Alina, a weaver's daughter with hands that smelled faintly of linen and dye. She laughed softly, as though she feared the world might punish her for happiness. Thomas would tell her stories about frog races and fool parades, and she'd smile like sunlight through rain. One evening, under the lantern glow, she said, "Do you think we'll ever live in a world where joy doesn't need to hide behind strangeness?" Thomas looked out at the crowd of jesters, drunks, and children chasing wooden hoops. "Maybe not," he said. "Maybe joy always hides behind something strange." Maybe that's what makes it real. Then came the Festival of Fools, the strangest of them all. It began as a day of laughter, but turned into a week of chaos. Priests dressed as pigs, men pretended to be kings, and women wore crowns of hay. For a few precious days, the poor could mock the rich, the weak could act strong, and the sad could forget sorrow. Tomas and Alina joined the crowd. They wore masks, she as a dove, he as a wolf. The streets were alive with music, drums, and bells. People danced around fires, shouting nonsense songs. It was madness, but in that madness was freedom. As dawn approached, Tomas removed his mask. He saw faces glowing with sweat and joy, people who had nothing, yet for one night felt everything. He took Alina's hand. "This," he said softly, "is what being human means. To find light, even if it burns strange." She smiled. "Then we must always remember it." And they did. Years later, when Tomas grew old, the fairs changed. The frog races faded, the jesters disappeared, the games grew quieter. But he'd sit by the fire and tell his grandchildren stories of those strange times. How people found happiness in places no one expected. "Grandfather," a little voice would ask, "was it true? People really laughed at frogs?" He'd chuckle. "Yes, child. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear them laugh on the wind." The candle would flicker, the night would fall still. And Tomas would whisper, "Remember, joy is never foolish. It's just old and waiting to be found again." Centuries later, we look back on them, those strange, forgotten people, and smile. We call their games foolish, their joys odd. But perhaps the fools were wiser than us. They knew that laughter heals, that silliness saves, that in the quiet between wars and winters, happiness was something worth chasing, no matter how strange it looked. So the next time you smile at something small, when a silly moment warms your heart, remember the people of the medieval fairs. The frog racers, the candle hands, the masked fools. And whisper to yourself, they too were searching for the same thing I am. Peace. Laughter. A reason to feel alive. And that is the strange, beautiful truth of the Middle Ages. The wind moved gently across the village fields, whispering through the wheat like an old memory. Tomas stood by the forge, older now, with hands rough and lined from years of work. His hair had gone the color of ash, and his laughter, once bright as bells, had softened into a quiet hum. Yet when spring came, something inside him still stirred. It was fair time again. He could hear the distant sound of pipes and tambourines drifting from the square. It had been many years since he had gone to the fair, but today, Alina insisted. "You can't grow too old for laughter," she told him with that same gentle smile that had once stopped him in his tracks as a young man. So they walked together through the winding lanes, past the smell of bread and hay, until they reached the market square where banners fluttered in the breeze. But things had changed. The old frog races were gone, replaced by a strange new game called Blind Man's Bluff, where people wore hoods and tried to catch one another by sound alone. Children screamed in delight, bumping into barrels and walls, while adults laughed from the sides. Tomas smiled faintly. "Still strange," he said. "Always strange," Alina replied. "That's how joy survives." They wandered further, past merchants and dancers. At the heart of the fair stood a raised wooden platform. A man in robes painted like the sky was telling stories, long, dramatic tales of saints, dragons, and miracles. People watched in rapture. "Miracle plays," Alina whispered. "They call them that now." The storyteller's voice rolled like thunder. He spoke of a knight who wrestled with an angel, and a baker who found a loaf that sang hymns at night. The crowd gasped, laughed, and crossed themselves. Tomas closed his eyes and let the voice wash over him. It was foolish, he thought, but somehow pure. These tales of saints and sinners gave the people what they needed most, a reason to believe the world still held wonder. When the play ended, coins clattered, children danced, and the air smelled of roasted nuts and wet grass. Tomas looked at Alina and said quietly, "We were born in a world of hunger, and yet somehow, people always find ways to make it beautiful. That night, as the fair faded into darkness, the village gathered around a bonfire. The old folk sang songs that were older than memory itself. One of them, a thin man with a crooked smile, began to recite a poem, a competition they called the story duel. Two tellers would stand before the fire, spinning tales one after another, trying to make the crowd laugh or cry before the other could. The man told a story about a talking chicken who wanted to become a priest. The crowd roared. Then a woman stepped up, fierce-eyed and quick-tongued, telling of a miserly ghost who haunted a wine cellar because he couldn't let go of his last bottle. Her voice rose and fell like music, and the crowd cheered until tears rolled down their cheeks. Alina laughed so hard she clutched her side. Tomas couldn't remember the last time he'd seen her so alive. He thought of how, even in a world with no luxuries, laughter could light the soul like a candle in the dark. When the duel ended, the woman bowed, and the fire crackled high into the night. Tomas whispered, "Even the poorest can be rich if they still have stories." Alina rested her head on his shoulder. "Then we are the richest of all." Years passed again. The children of Hatherby grew into adults, and the faces Tomas knew slowly disappeared. Yet each generation found its own way to chase joy. One year, a troupe of wandering musicians arrived, carrying strange instruments, flutes carved from bone, drums stretched with goat hide, and something new called a hurdy-gurdy. They played in the square until midnight, their music wild and hypnotic. The villagers danced. Not in pairs or lines, but in great circles that swayed like waves. They called it the Dance of St. John, meant to drive away bad spirits. Tomas and Alina joined in, laughing breathlessly. "Do you think we look foolish?" she asked. He smiled. "If being foolish means feeling alive, then I hope we never stop." But not all strange joys were so harmless. That same summer, a sickness came from the south. People whispered it was carried by rats or by the wind, but no one knew for sure. The sickness took the strong and the weak alike. The fairs grew quiet. The laughter faded. Alina fell ill one autumn night. Tomas stayed by her side, tending her with trembling hands. She smiled weakly, even in fever. "Don't look so sad, my love," she whispered. "The world has always been strange. So even this is part of it." He tried to smile. "I'll wait for the next fair. You'll be there. We'll laugh again." But she didn't answer. When she passed, the winter that followed felt endless. The fields froze, the river stopped. Tomas worked in silence, the forge cold beside him. Yet sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could almost hear her laughter again, faint, drifting on the wind that came from the fairground. One spring morning, the bells rang once more. The plague had passed. Life, as it always does, began to crawl back into the world. The villagers gathered again, unsure whether to laugh or weep. And then someone, perhaps to test fate, brought out a mask, a painted wooden face with a long nose and bright eyes. They called it the Dance of the Masks. Everyone wore a mask, dancing through the streets, pretending to be someone else, noblemen, animals, angels, even death himself. Tomas watched from his doorway, feeling the weight of years on his shoulders. Then a little girl approached him. "Will you not dance, old man?" she asked shyly. He looked down and saw she wore a dove mask, white, with a soft curve of feathers. For a moment, his heart stopped. Alina's mask. He rose slowly, joints stiff but spirit alight. "Yes," he said, "I think I will." He joined the dancers. The drumbeats echoed through his bones. Around him spun peasants and children, all hiding behind painted faces, laughing louder than they had in years. It was strange, beautiful, and just a little sad. As the dance reached its peak, Tomas closed his eyes and whispered, "You were right, Alina. Joy never dies, it only changes its shape." That night, the villagers gathered for a new game, a custom that had begun after the sickness, meant to honor those who had passed. They called it the Game of Whispers. Everyone sat in a circle. One person would whisper a story to the next, who would change one small part before passing it on. By the time it reached the last person, the story had transformed completely. It was silly, but it made them laugh. Tomas joined in, whispering softly, "Once upon a time, a boy made a frog race." By the time it reached the last child, it had become, "Once upon a time, a prince turned into a frog to win a kingdom." Everyone laughed until tears rolled down their cheeks. Tomas smiled. Somewhere deep in his chest, warmth bloomed again. The world, for all its pain, still found room for laughter. Seasons turned once more. Tomas grew frail. His forge went silent, and his hands trembled when he lifted a cup. But his eyes still held that spark. The younger folk often visited him to hear stories of the old fairs, of jesters and fools, of races and songs. They found it hard to believe. Did people truly laugh at frogs? One boy asked. They did, Tomas said with a grin. And they laughed with their whole hearts. He told them about Alina, about the Feast of Fools, about the miracle plays and the Dance of the Masks. When he spoke, even the wind outside seemed to hush, as though the world itself listened. You see, Tomas said, laughter is not foolishness. It's courage. In my time, we laughed because we were afraid of war, of hunger, of death. Laughter was how we said, "You will not break us." The children sat silently, eyes wide. One girl whispered, "Then we must never stop laughing." Tomas smiled softly. Never. When he finally passed away one quiet summer night, the village gathered for his funeral. But it was not a somber affair. They buried him beside Alina, beneath the old oak by the fairground. The air was warm, and someone, perhaps remembering his words, brought a small wooden frog and placed it on his grave. Then the children began to laugh. Not mockingly, but softly, joyfully. One began to hum a tune from the old fairs. The adults joined in, clapping gently, singing as the sun went down. It was the strangest funeral anyone had ever seen. And perhaps, the most beautiful. Generations passed. The world changed. Castles fell, towns grew, and time carried everything away. But even in the new age, when laughter came from music halls instead of fairs, when people read stories instead of hearing them by firelight, something remained. The memory of laughter in the face of hardship. The belief that even the strangest joy has meaning. And if, one quiet evening, you walk through an old English village, you might still hear echoes, faint and distant, of a boy cheering for a frog, of a woman laughing beneath a paper mask, of stories whispered through generations. You might hear Tomas's voice, carried by the wind, saying gently, "Find joy even in the strange. That's what makes life worth living." The candle flickers low now. The story ends. But the laughter, the ancient, foolish, beautiful laughter, never really does. It lingers in every heart that dares to smile when the world feels heavy. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson the Middle Ages ever gave us. That the strangest things people did for fun were never truly strange at all. They were simply ways to remember that we are human. And that to be human is to find light, even when the world grows dark.